to be the final session. I think I can speak for all when I say this has been a very long day, very content-rich day with wide-ranging discussions, obviously, that we've had up until now. And I don't think I'm overstating it when I say that today's conference, today's side session, is ending with a bang, is ending with a great highlight here. We are here for the President's panel titled NATO Quo Vadis, and I couldn't have asked for two more formidable speakers, both giants really in their own fields who have left their marks in politics. I couldn't be more delighted to speak to them now in just a moment. To my immediate right, obviously, she's the former president of the Republic of Latvia. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President Vaira VÍÄE-FREIBERGA. Lovely to have you with us indeed, and also truly delighted to welcome here on stage the former Estonian president, Kersti, ladies and gentlemen, is here. Much to talk about, President Freiberga. Throughout this day here, we try to, as like a good doctor, we try to analyze NATO. Is it in good health? Is it in robust health? Is it ailing? Is it in decline? Based on your experience and your observation, what would be your diagnosis, if you will, of NATO's current status?
Thank you for inviting me and being here, and thank you to my colleague for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, you look very sprightly and awake for this late in the day. I'm very pleased to see that. And I think NATO, similarly, is, as far as I'm concerned, looking in rather good shape. And periodically, of course, somebody lets out cries for help, for cries of distress about its future, about its necessity, its raison d'être, its mission, its soul, its need, its everything, and so on. And I think we can quote the old, I think it was George Bernard Shaw who said, you have read the news about my passing, and I'd just like to inform you that the news of my demise have been premature. And I think that any concerns about the ability of NATO to survive the various vagaries that obviously are part of life and the challenges that are not necessarily the same today, tomorrow, and the day after. In my rather long experience, I have seen NATO growing, expanding, consolidating. Frankly, for us in this particular region of the world, every morning when I get up, I say to myself, thank God we're part of NATO, and thank God for the existence of NATO, because otherwise I think I would feel rather anxious by looking at some of the news. So I would say NATO will survive. How many years would you want us to prognosticate for?
well, we can debate. It's up for negotiation here. But of course, the conference is titled NATO 2030 and beyond. The beyond is up for discussion.
Beyond, I fear for a while, because the way the world is shaping up, I think collective security is not going to diminish. The need for it is going to increase. And NATO, of course, will have to transform itself. It will have to grow. It will have to evolve. It will need closer coordination between its members. But it will survive because, alas, I think the need for collective security will not go away.
NATO is strong, NATO is healthy, says President Freiberga. What does Dr. KALJULAID say to the patient NATO? Is it as equally in good health? Do you see it equally as in good health as does your colleague?
Well, frankly, I've never seen NATO as a patient. And indeed, I totally agree with President VÍÄE-FREIBERGA that NATO is an adaptive entity, but we cannot speak in abstract terms about NATO as an adaptive entity. We have to understand that it is our decisions which adapt and shape NATO. And indeed, today, this morning, listening also to Secretary General Stoltenberg, we have to admire how NATO has been able to more quickly rise its deterrence levels where it is necessary to react to the threat of terror, for example, when it has been necessary. Despite the fact that it has a 10-year planning cycle in its concept, NATO has never been slow to react. And this is because, after all, it has military discipline in its decision-making. On the other hand, if I do think what we need to prepare ourselves more and exercise more, then this is precisely not just having the capabilities ready, but knowing also how these capabilities will be brought out in case there is a real need in whichever corner of NATO, and being also, as politicians, exercised in decision-making, so that we will not be fooled, for example, by various hybrid situations, whether this really is an element of war in it or there isn't. And we know that 21st century is much more complicated on that particular element. So indeed, NATO is always strong, but it is only strong because NATO has been led, it has been taking decisions to be strong, and this has been the case.
NATO is strong, once again echoing the sentiments of your fourth speaker. Of course, both Latvia and Estonia, you joined NATO at the same time. Your experience is identical. You joined in 2004 and have been, as you both say, benefiting from this membership ever since, from being part of it. Nonetheless, you spoke, President KALJULAID, you spoke of challenges, and President FREIBERGA, let's go into detail and look at some of those challenges. Obviously, one of the issues that has unsurprisingly come up throughout the day was, of course, Russia and Russia's obviously amassing troops near the Ukrainian border. The call for solidarity on the part of NATO for Ukraine is certainly there, but a lot of people are saying, well, that's on paper, that sounds good. In theory, it sounds good. But at the end of the day, as we see in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, when push comes to shove, really NATO is not acting, cannot act, whatever you want to call it. Looking at the signs that we're seeing right now at the Ukrainian border, what should NATO's response be here, if any?
Here is one of the challenges that NATO will really have to pull up its socks to face up to, because in 2014, I'm afraid, it was not its most shining hour. The politics of and strategy of Russia are moved by a very antiquated concept of what makes for the greatness of a country. And President Putin, who grew up in the Soviet times, seems to have almost an obsession, really a deep obsession with making Russia great again, rather like Mr. Trump wishing to make America great again, but with much more serious and nefarious consequences for those who happen to live in its neighborhood, because this emotional need for greatness, which in many ways fed the Russian people, giving them pride in the nuclear power, in the importance in United Nations and so on of the Soviet Union, when they were lacking in household goods, when they were lacking in standard of living, when they were lacking in freedoms of expression, freedom of travel and everything else. They kept receiving this propaganda, but they were great. They were great. And they're great how? Everybody's scared of them because they have nuclear arms. And I think President Putin is playing on that, and he's playing chicken. And in 2014 and in 2008 in Georgia, I think he won the game of chicken, you see, with NATO. And this can't go on for very long without some sort of reaction, more consolidated, more firm. In other words, we don't want lines drawn in the sand which then get ignored and completely forgotten, because then leaders who do that, frankly, lose their prestige, without naming names here. The lines in the sand must be drawn. NATO should have a firm stand on what it understands about the sovereignty of nations. Because we have the United Nations and we have all sorts of other institutions, But again and again, we see both at political levels and in international institutions the idea that some are bigger than others, therefore they're more important than others. And the old Monroe doctrine that the states had adopted, and that surely has not necessarily been the most felicitous sort of line of policy that they have pursued in Vietnam and in Korea and elsewhere, the lines in the sand here are that you cannot admit and accept a country claiming that its will and its desire for greatness sort of wipes away, destroys, ignores the wishes and desires of neighboring nations. When Mr. Putin says that Ukraine is part of its sphere of influence, he is telling the Ukrainians what they should be thinking and where they should be. It is up to the Ukrainians to decide where they wish to be. And if NATO and its members cannot accept this absolutely fundamental basic principle of respecting nations, large or small, and their wish and desire for sovereignty, and absolutely throwing into the dustbin of history this outdated, antiquated concept of spheres of influence, we'll be in trouble.
Indeed, which is why, President KALJULAID, the question, of course, remains pertinent. God forbid if Russia were to threaten one of your countries, certainly the consequences it would have to face are clear. In this particular case, where we do see a significant buildup of Russian troops near the Ukrainian border, with Ukraine obviously not being a NATO member, the outcome is not quite so clear. I think no one is disputing NATO's readiness and ability to act. I think the willingness here is on the table, President KALJULAID.
Well, first and foremost, indeed, we should always distinguish that even if, of course, it was not a great moment for the free world, what happened to Georgia, and it was to our shame that we didn't recognize truly what happened in Georgia, and we returned to business as usual with Russia relatively quickly. I mean, neither Georgia nor Ukraine were under the NATO's protective umbrella, and that's a huge difference. This we need always to remember as well. But I do share this view that if the stance of the free world had been stronger after Georgian partial occupation, Crimea might have never happened, but it wasn't. And that's why the avalanche reached from Georgia to Ukraine. And now I think we have understood the geopolitical error which there was made, and we have held our red lines on the principle for Ukraine, but also for the free world. We have taken stronger stance. We haven't resolved this crisis, but we have been at least holding our own. And I think this is also important, that we do keep having strategic patience. That, I mean, we didn't paint Russia into the corner. It did so itself. So it is not our obligation to now paint Russia out of that corner. We need to have strategic patience and insist and be adamant that we stand by Helsinki Final Acts, to which Russia is a signatory, because they inherited the signature of the Soviet Union. So I wouldn't tell it is NATO's weakness, as President VÍÄE-FREIBERGA said, but it was the general Western weakness and misreading of what went wrong in Georgia. Because 1 year before Georgian war, there was a proposal in Munich Security Conference by then President Medvedev to renegotiate the Helsinki system. And we said no. And then when they acted, we didn't react strongly, so we taught the wrong lesson. Luckily, we have now understood what was that. Again, this discussion to me is kind of bigger than NATO, because NATO is an organization which is taking responsibility for the security of its members. It has partners with whom it also works, but as far as members are concerned, it has 100% track record. This needs to be remembered. And therefore, any parallel is not welcome. On the other hand, situation in Ukraine is obvious risk. And I think that looking at the whole picture, where indeed, I totally agree, Russia is trying to present itself as a global power with the resources, economic resources, which are not sufficient for such a presentation, then of course it realizes that it has to find smart, relatively cheap ways to keep us on the tiptoes, be an irritator. And this is what seems to be right now on the go. So we should not only look at the obvious, but also try to analyze and understand what is less obvious. So things might go wrong or go right unexpectedly. So we cannot assume that we are able to predict. And this is the biggest problem. I mean, the visibility is really low, and it's a whole lot of unpredictability. Now, what should then NATO do in this context? This is the question. And I think that NATO has to first accept that there is such a high level of unpredictability, and therefore be absolutely ready and well exercised for all situations we can think, and even the unthinkable. Think the unthinkable, and then plan even for the unthinkable, and then have plans ready in different cupboards, which you are then ready to take out. For example, if you know that there is a risk that there will be a kind of a conventional conflict somewhere, make sure you are able to keep the airspace free to bring in additional follow-on forces. Have it decided among the allies who and how does what in case things go wrong. Yes, do it, even if you know that in any concrete case it will require a political decision of any member state. But at least know what you would ask for, what you would need, and who has exercised for whom, for which kind of situation. This is the best we can plan for our NATO. So I agree with you, political element is indeed very strong in this kind of planning. To recognize that while we know that, I mean, political support will in any case be needed, but the technical readiness is there in the cupboard to be taken out and used. And indeed, it cannot be only for conventional, it has to be for hybrid and for all kind of unthinkable situations. A fire in the wood, in the forest somewhere in an eastern flank countries, which then somebody comes from the other side to help to put out. I mean, we saw also during the beginning of the COVID pandemic, Russian army planes flying to Italy with supplies. These kind of things we need to think about, I mean, where things could go, let's say, accidentally wrong, that we are ready to recognize. And here, I am very optimistic, because, you know, I was very worried when the Belarus-Polish or first Belarus-Lithuanian border hybrid attack started. I was worried that people will mistake it for a migration crisis. Guess what? They didn't. So there is hope.
And that migration crisis, I'm going to come to you and talk about in more detail in just a second. NATO has learned its lesson from the 2014 debacle, you say, and should keep all its options open at this particular point. President Freiberger, I've had an interview here this morning with the Spanish Foreign Minister, Minister Alvarez, who said, yes, this all sounds great, but at the end of the day, really, the only conceivable and desirable option would be to engage in dialogue with Russia, to engage in dialogue with Putin, to engage in dialogue with Moscow. Is that a fruitful, is that a productive path ahead? Is that also something that you would plead for, or would you say, based on previous experiences, this is a dead-end road? What do you say?
I was invited to have a dialogue with President Putin at in the early months of his being elected. And immediately he put conditions on it, that it should be unofficial, that it should happen on neutral ground, and that I should come with one security person accompanying me, whereas he had occupied a whole village in Austria with 117 security men. And I said, yes, of course, I mean, we're neighbors. Dialogue, possibility of dialogue, anytime. And then I discovered, which I know ahead, but firsthand, that you see, his idea of dialogue is sort of sitting down, and then he has a pile of papers in front of him. Oh, he said we would have this would not be no official documents, you know, with just free. We'd have dinner together and free discussion and very informal. He arrives with a great big pile of documents and says, you're doing this wrong and that wrong, and we don't like this and we don't like that. And of course, yes, we can be friends, but you have to change your language laws, you have to change your education laws, you have to do this, you have to do that, etc., etc. And I think he hasn't changed. I haven't seen him in many years, but from what I see in the news, it's the same man, just a bit older like all of us, but really, his idea of dialogue is actually I think, a monologue. Like in 17th century French classical plays, you know, where the hero gets on the stage and then delivers a long monologue about where he stands and what he's all about and so on. And dialogues are much less interesting. Of course one must keep contacts. Of course one must have diplomatic relations. Of course one must participate in international bodies such as the United Nations. But the idea that a man who is basically, well, from our, if you like, if you define rationality, the sort of thing that we in the West define as rationality, then let's put it to be polite, his rationality is from a different planet. His idea, his reasoning is totally different, which means by definition, from the start, if you think you are going to convince him of something that seems to you obvious, then the hopes are very slim. I think the only hope of an engagement here is a win-win kind of exchange, tit for tat sort of thing. Like when people say, oh, well, he amassed 100,000 troops on the border of Ukraine. Just, you know, just for the decoration, as it were. You know, imagine the cost of doing that. Because President Biden, after his election, wouldn't talk to him. And look at that, behold, after having amassed these 100,000 troops, he got himself a tete-a-tete with President Biden. Isn't that wonderful? He'll do it again. This is childish, but this is reality.
President KALJULAID, President FREIBERGA was just saying her experience with President Putin was, shall we say, less productive. It was less a dialogue, more a monologue. You met with him, obviously, several times when you were president. Does that sound familiar at all?
Well, frankly speaking, yes, of course, we need to be able to talk because home truths need to be said. This is obvious. But of course, similarly to President VÍÄE-FREIBERGA, I mean, we absolutely value, the rules-based world order. Each and every nation has the right to decide their own future. He obviously thinks differently. He thinks that those who have power, for them there has to be a power-based world order. The big ones, the powerful ones, have the right to decide also for the other nation. I mean, we cannot overcome it, however much we talk. On the other hand, we as close neighbors, for example, if I close my country's border with Russia because there is pandemic, I call him and tell him so. I mean, this is obvious. I mean, we need to, of course, keep talking, even to say home truths or even to simply exchange technical information. This needs to be done, but of course you cannot, sell your own values while you are doing it. This is also obvious. On the other hand, I think we should maybe enlarge this debate a little bit, because you mentioned here already the Spanish Minister of Foreign Affairs, and frankly speaking, I feel sorry for the southerners who come here to Riga and all they hear is about what is important about the NATO's eastern flank, whereas, they have their own array of problems at the NATO's southern flank. It was very interesting what he said about Mali and Sahel, for example. Estonia, by the way, is participating with French in the Mali mission. We've also been to Central African Republic to help out the southern flank. Of course, the southern missions could be also called Afghanistan, Iraq. So I think we need to take a wider picture, and gossiping about President Putin doesn't take us anywhere. The situation's unpredictable, there is no clear visibility, and one prediction, therefore, is not better than the other. We have to be prepared, we have to be trained, and at the same time, we also have to understand that even if we want to see where President Putin is acting, it isn't necessarily in East, it could as easily be in South. And that's also we should pay attention to.
Most definitely, many challenges beyond this region, no doubt. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, these days, what dictates the headlines are not just Ukraine, but also, and this is the point.
Precisely, and never look at the obvious. Always something which is less obvious tends to happen with unpredictable neighbors. Isn't it so? That's why I would warn us only to be concentrating on a narrow picture. Let's look also what is going on indeed in Mali, in Libya, elsewhere, as the Foreign Minister of Spain asked us to do.
But with your permission, actually, let's also raise the point that you have mentioned, namely the humanitarian crisis at the border in Belarus. I think we cannot go by without at least mentioning the cynical game that Lukashenko is playing there in orchestrating the surge of migrants to try to get into the EU via Belarus. Again, because this is perhaps you could say on paper, first and foremost, an EU problem, but there are NATO countries like Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland that are heavily affected, of course, by the situation there, with no solution inside. President FREIBERGA, what would be your set of plan here, your advice, your solution on how to solve the migration problem there, on how not to fall for Lukashenko's cynical game and trying to capitalize and instrumentalize human beings there at the border?
Using refugees, people who are fleeing their homes and leaving everything behind, or migrants who see no future for themselves or their children in the place where they have been born and where they have lived, has become instrumentalized as a weapon of war. And what is happening now on the eastern borders of the European Union and of NATO, mostly Poland, less Lithuania and less Latvia, is, I think, an adaptation of an already well-developed tool of hybrid warfare, which started out back in 2014, I think, when the Mediterranean became the grave of so many poor souls who had been told, who had received propaganda, where there had been a whole information war, first of all, telling them that by paying so much for their passage, the doors to paradise would open, they would be received in countries where the standard of living was higher, where there were social security sort of networks to hold them up and so on. And many people were misled. What we now see happening on the eastern border is people who have been encouraged, and they are desperate people, many of them, but many others are adventurers. And the thing is, every country, of course, everywhere in the world, does check who enters that country. You simply cannot have people wandering around like sheep in a field. People have identities, there are agreements between countries, and they need to be checked. But these people are being solicited. There's a collaboration with travel bureaus, with airlines and so on, to bring them over there with misleading information about how they're going to have a happy corridor that will lead them to the country of their choice. They have absolutely no understanding of how border controls work. They have no understanding of the geography even of Europe, because let's face it, going to the Polish border is really not the most logical place to go if Germany is your goal, or even outside of the European Union, Great Britain is a place where you'd like to be. And these people are we see that they're being driven to the border, and incidents are being staged and are being planned. And what worries me is that any moment now, tomorrow, in a week or two, there will be provocations that will try and escalate the tensions on that border and provoke as a response, a needed response that will be interpreted as an excuse for using those 100,000 troops, not just for decoration, but actually for military action. I truly am very worried, and I think that the international organizations, starting with the United Nations, should be taking a more active role. It is up to international organizations to be looking after these people stuck at the border, not necessarily because of their own ill intent, but definitely because of the ill intent of President Lukashenko. And as a former refugee of post-World War II, who was fed for 4 years of my life by UNRRA and then IRO as an institution, I do not see why the United Nations cannot assume a similar role instead of leaving neighboring countries. And this, by the way, applies to Calais in France and to Lampedusa in Italy and to various Lesbos and other islands in the Mediterranean. There should be much more vigorous, intense attempts to organize solutions, because this is increasingly being used as an instrument of hybrid warfare, and people are suffering as a result. And the usual methods of humanitarian aid are not sufficient. We need more and better.
And that's certainly a crisis that I fear will be with us for some time to come, President KALJULAID.
Yes, definitely, and we should clearly recognize, first and foremost, what is the status of those people, what is the humanitarian situation, what is the legal situation, and then which role each and every multilateral body or individual countries can take. First and foremost, Belarus is a safe place for people who felt insecure in Iraq. So if they needed a safe haven where to ask for refugee status, Belarus, while not being a safe place for their own opposition, is perfectly safe for those people. Second, United Nations, indeed, in the Security Council where Estonia is, we have been raising this issue as well. United Nations as an UNHCR, which is in Belarus and is active as well. Similarly, Red Cross is operating in Belarus. These people, well, considering the global catastrophe of migration, there are not so many. I'm quite sure that, if Belarus administration lets Red Cross and UNHCR to, operate, then basically the basic needs until the solution is found, people may fly back, people may seek refugee, ask for refugee status in Belarus. This situation can be handled without humanitarian catastrophe if the Belarus administration works together with multilateral bodies. Now if we come to the European Union is doing everything it can to stop, airlines flying people from those places to Minsk. It has even adapted its sanction regime to be able to do it better. Sanction package number 5 is ready, 6th is also being prepared. This is what EU is doing. And the EU also has sent very clear signals saying this is a hybrid attack, this is not a migration crisis as we've seen in the last years. This has been the EU's major role. Now we come to the NATO's role. NATO is an organization where every ally can put their security worry on the table. If Latvia, Lithuania or Poland feels there is a need, they will come to NATO table. And I can guarantee you Estonia will definitely support seeking the most adequate solutions using also NATO's capabilities. So far, this has not been the case, but this doesn't mean bilaterally there has not been working together. In the summer, Estonia helped Lithuanian border guards with surveillance capabilities. Right now, there are also Estonian police and border guard people in Poland, and also, first time ever in 30 years, Estonia has called upon its reserve army for volunteers. Well, it's not a big amount, but a few tenths of volunteers who are supporting Polish army, police and border guard. That is how seriously and as our own we take this hybrid attack. This is the state of play today. Things might change tomorrow, but then we need to again go through all this cycle. What is everybody's role? What is the international law? Never to forget that these people are definitely innocent and act accordingly.
It's halftime here in this session. I think the first part we dedicated, and rightly so, to the current events that are dominating the headlines and that are causing a lot of people grief and concern in this region in particular. But the session, of course, is titled NATO Quo Vadis. So let's use the remainder, the second half, if you will, of the session to look ahead, to look at the role of NATO. Just a few years, we celebrated the 70th anniversary, 7 decades of NATO. Now we're looking ahead. And we're looking ahead, President Freiberger, at a time where NATO is arguably wounded, where its reputation is undermined due to the hasty withdrawal in Afghanistan. We see a United States, a Washington that is bit by bit withdrawing from international events and is insisting on Europe to to do their own share, to pick up a strong and their own military capabilities. Clearly, NATO cannot exist without the United States. Where do you see the move forward? Because the mood in Washington, there's clearly no longer an appetite to engage in these sort of big military operations, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. It's going to be a pretty tough sell domestically for any president, regardless of which power and party.
All these incidents that started American intervention in way back in Korea, then in Vietnam, then in Iraq, then in Afghanistan, were really completely outside of the realm of what is included in the treaties that are the base of NATO. So in many ways, you might say this is American foreign policy at work for various reasons of what are considered American interests, and they are beyond what NATO was created for and is meant for. And to some extent, this remains true today. America and Europe have been joined as allies ever since, well, the American Revolution, frankly. General Lafayette went to the United States, and Benjamin Franklin did diplomacy in Paris and so on, and ever since there has been this collaboration. When the Second World War broke out, and Churchill was worried about the very weak state of British defense forces as opposed to the Wehrmacht, which had really grown some muscle, he kept desperately calling up President Roosevelt, and President Roosevelt, without in fact the Congress approval, continued to send help to Britain at the start of the war. And it wasn't until Pearl Harbor that they realized that the axis had been formed between the unlikely allies, Japan, on one side of the world and Germany on the other, and that America was necessarily involved in both. If you look at today and tomorrow, America will remain a huge power with two oceans flanking its shores. And it's obvious that it would be short-sighted of any American president or any American Congress and Senate to remain fixated only on the transatlantic alliances and American interests. Obviously, just like Canada, by the way, they have to look to the Pacific side and the Pacific theater, which is what they're doing. But what has been a constant element in this partnership between Europe and North America has been the ability of Europeans, sometimes very small groups of them, sometimes just groups of resistance, as in France, but to unite in common values, in common goals, and yes, fighting against a common enemy if such happened to arise, and somehow they keep arising again and again. The need for Europeans to have closer collaboration with each other has been pointed out by the Americans since the year one, I think. It remains a very much an actuality. Europe is too fragmented. Europe is vulnerable to the extent that it is insufficiently able to coordinate and insufficiently able to move, say, battle groups from one place to another. The recent years and the changes in strategy of NATO have been, especially for the eastern border, have been very much welcome and very much needed. And I do hope that NATO will understand this and that the leaders of Europe will understand it as well. France, for instance, is very much for having a force de frappe that Europe would have. I think we all could agree with that. We do not want a weak Europe. A weak Europe cannot be a proper partner to a strong America. Or should America, for any reason, become weaker at some point of crisis, then a strong Europe could compensate for it. To me, it's a no-brainer. You really have to have a stronger Europe to be part of a stronger alliance.
President Kalju, we need a stronger Europe, says President Freiberger, something that has been mentioned numerous times here, obviously, on stage today. And it sounds great in theory, of course, and in rhetoric. But from your own personal experience as a head of state also, the frustration on the part of Washington is real, isn't it, when it comes to their dealings with the Europeans, starting from burden sharing all the way up until not playing the part that Europe ought to be from Washington's perspective. The shared values is one thing, no doubt. I think nobody would attest to that. But the frustration is there.
Well, and it's long-standing. I mean, Europe has been underspending on defense, and this has been the message for a long time. We agreed in Wales to start moving towards 2%. You cannot say we are not moving, but we are moving really slowly.
That was in 2014.
Yeah. Nevertheless, there are now more member states who do meet the 2% criteria. At that point, we could say that there were very few. Now the number is greater, and there is more resources also in the NATO's coffers. This is a good thing, but indeed, I understand this is deeply insufficient. And I believe seriously that Europe should spend more on its own defense. But we've also walked a long way from this kind of common acceptance that indeed we cannot operate, we cannot exercise even the smallest, operation in the European-owned surroundings without, physical, not only moral support from Americans, and that this is the natural state of play. To the point where the High Representative Borrell said, a couple of years ago in Munich, that Europe needs capabilities. So we are more or less on the same page, and we are also slowly moving. I understand impatience, but I'm also insisting here that we need to see the positives. And also, if you think during the time when history ended, it would be kind of weird for NATO at that time to beef up kind of defense capabilities and deterrence capabilities in this region, whereas there was thereafter the terrorist threat, and we reacted to that threat. And then, of course, we must always understand that NATO, with its limited resources, is not fit to do kind of long-standing, comprehensive exercises which should change nations. And here comes this ability to speak the truth to your own people. Everybody almost has forgotten what was NATO's mission in Afghanistan. It was to stop the terrorist attacks on European soil or elsewhere in the Allied territories. This has been achieved. But many politicians sell in their own country this as an exercise to change Afghan society, which also probably has happened. The coming years will show, whether it was really also happening or it wasn't happening. But again, this was not NATO's call for action. It was different. And we have
but even based on that, the threat of terror now with the terror return of the Taliban is very real, no?
We don't know yet. Taliban first time now itself faces this need to, balance all the active groups in the country, and they're finding it equally difficult. We don't know, and as I said, let's not predict what we cannot predict, but let's be honest about what we set out to do and what we did. This was, this is not NATO's failure, that Afghanistan is not a prosperous democratic country. This was not NATO's mission. And we should always, understand that, what NATO is for. It is for the protection of its member states, to make sure that we are all unharmed. And for that we need indeed to do far more. I totally agree. I also support that Europe has set up European Defence Fund, and also in the NATO there will be a foundation which will support collective developments, so that we will have more interoperability also in our defense equipment, because this is a big technical problem and also a big market-related problem, because if you have only, monopolies and oligopolies on defense market, then the inflation in the sector, as we saw when we started to only talk about moving towards 2%, was outpassing the inflation elsewhere or the economic growth. So the countries who were already at 2% in real terms could invest less because of the rise of prices in the defense sector. To avoid that in the future, we are working to make sure that we have kind of common development of our defense capabilities, but they will be rather interoperable than monopolistic or oligopolistic. And this, I believe, is very important for the 21st century, because the nature of war has also totally changed. War and civil society are far more intertwined. And this now brings me to the question which I already have asked today once in this room from Jens Stoltenberg. Who takes responsibility for what? I mean, I believe that for the avoiding the hostile takeover of our economies by politically biased capital, this is EU's role, because we have procurement rules, we have competition regulation. Making sure that our 5G networks are built under the principle of trusted connectivity. Again, this is more EU and also OECD, Blue Dot, Build Back Better World. These kind of collective understandings that democratic world must control our connections in the future. Otherwise, they could all be used as weapons against us, like now these poor people in Belarus are being used as weapons. Our greeds could serve as weapons. Economic takeover is a weapon. We need to also see who takes which role, and clearly also in this new NATO strategic concept, maybe say out what NATO doesn't take responsibility for, and where is the role therefore for EU and other bodies.
A vital reminder of why NATO was founded and why it is existing, namely, first and foremost, to protect its members, which of course then begs the question, President Freiberga, if that is the mission, and right now NATO stands at 30 members, Northern Macedonia, Montenegro were the last to join, obviously, and now a lot of people are looking towards NATO for the next move, for a possible enlargement, if that is even in the cards. Obviously, Kiev is very hopeful, as is Tbilisi, Georgia and Ukraine, very much hoping to be part of this alliance in order to be part of this mantra and philosophy that President KALJULAID was saying, namely that is our first and foremost mission, to protect and safeguard our members. It's only understandable that those countries who feel the pressure and the threat want to be part of this alliance. Do you think, realistically speaking, the alliance at this particular juncture is willing and able to absorb more countries?
That is the eternal question. When Latvia was one of the candidate states, before the Big Bang enlargement of when 10 countries were taken on, we wore out a lot of pairs of shoes, you know, in diplomatic efforts among the 15 members of NATO, or was it by then? Oh, it was more than that at the time, because 3 had been already added. There was a great deal of convincing to be done about the benefits of enlarging the common space of stability and security to which nations with the same commitment to democratic principles, to non-violence and no imperialistic intents and desires and long-term aims to which they could belong. When we had the NATO summit in Prague in 2002, and we were being announced that yes, enlargement was going to happen, I laid aside the speech that had been carefully prepared for it, and I said, what is important now is for us as candidate countries to thank the existing members for the wisdom and their ability to think long term, because this enlargement most definitely will extend the space of democratic convictions, democratic rule of law, peace and security beyond what used to be the Iron Curtain and divided the world and was, of course, the dividing line where this side were allies, on the other side were enemies. pushing further the area to which allies belong is something that strengthens an alliance, on condition that all new members do subscribe to certain basic requirements. And believe you me, in this large enlargement of 10 countries, I as president can testify we jumped through hoops, not just for the European Union, but for the demands of NATO. They wanted us to fight corruption. They wanted us to improve our methods of governance. They had a variety of requirements that we were meant to satisfy so that we would not weaken the alliance, but would make our contributions to it. And I think that the intervening years since then have shown, as President KALJULAID has pointed out, even small countries can contribute, specialists, they can contribute small battle groups. They can. We found, for instance, in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in Kosovo, that our medical personnel, especially our female doctors in the army, were treating women who never in their lives had met a doctor or had an interaction with a doctor, so that the contributions are not necessarily atomic weapons and atomic submarines and troop carriers, important as they are. The alliance is sufficiently differentiated that each nation can find its niche of contribution and together truly make an alliance that is multifaceted in its capabilities. But it should be one thing that is very important. It should be agile in its ability. And so far, the agility, I think, is something on which we still have to work.
And agility, of course, sometimes also comes down to numbers. Therefore, President KALJULAID, the same question to you. Is enlargement on the table, in the cards? Is it even desirable?
Well, as Ambassador Luik already said, since 2008 we've had the understanding that one day this will happen. And indeed, President VÍÄE-FREIBERGA is right to say that many hoops had to be jumped through before we could join. And for us it was this understanding that first you can join the European Union, a body which it is easier to get in, and only thereafter you can aspire for NATO, but the basis is anyway Copenhagen criteria. I mean, you have to have a proper rule of law state, and this has to be ready when the window of opportunity opens, because it stays open about 2.5 minutes. Then you have no time to adjust anything. So, I mean, this is a kind of valuable lesson from the past, which President VÍÄE-FREIBERGA brought in. But on the other hand, we cannot predict the future, because meanwhile we've seen that NATO has been more open to new members in the last decade than has been European Union. So our paradigm is not fully applicable anymore. But similarly, today's paradigm may not be applicable tomorrow, and there might be again the window of opportunity. And meanwhile, indeed, we started when we regained independence. I mean, we were always very proud that we are not consumers of security. You also started saying we have benefited from NATO. You are right. But I mean, we had been independent for 3 years when both of us went into operation. Initially, it was indeed Bosnia-Herzegovina, I believe, was our first military mission. We have also been contributors to the global security. And for that matter, I also want to recognize Georgian efforts, for example, in Afghanistan, who were there with really big contingent. I mean, Ukraine evidently is more in the situation of putting the oxygen mask first on yourself before helping the others. But indeed, I mean, they are also contributing. So this is very important. And indeed, the rule of law in the countries is one of the criteria, because both EU and NATO, they are value-based bodies, and this comes first and foremost. We are even free to argue, to disagree. We are safe in it because we know we share the values. And frankly speaking, you said something which is equally very important. There cannot be NATO without the transatlantic participation. And this is also the beginning of the all and the end of all. And we must do everything to keep this bond strong, relevant, and also visible, because, I mean, this has a deterrent effect in itself. This is also very important. But I sincerely hope that, I mean, when the window of opportunity is open for Georgia and Ukraine, all the other criteria have been met, and they will be through in 90 seconds, which they will have at that point.
And relevance is the word that I want to pick up for the final round. Unfortunately, time passes by very quickly when being in presence of such formidable figures. But let me ask you the final question here. The question, of course, that has come up today, before that, and certainly on the sidelines with the foreign ministers meeting today in Riga, is whether and how NATO can stay relevant in 2030 and beyond. My question to you is, it will. Why?
It will need to understand that conventional warfare is not going to disappear, and therefore to continue developing to be ready for conventional warfare. But it will have to give increasing weight and importance to manifestations of hybrid warfare, so that the centers of excellence that it has created in Estonia and in Latvia and elsewhere, where aspects of disinformation, identification, countering of misinformation, the spread of radicalization. There have been algorithms by now discovered, for instance, how groups can get radicalized through the simple money-making algorithms that, for instance, social platforms have adopted. All these aspects, this is just the beginning. When artificial intelligence continues to make the enormous strides it has been recently making, the virtual world is going to become a battleground, a very serious battleground. The realm of information, how it is presented, where it comes from, how it is evaluated, how it is accessible, will become just as crucial as the availability of battle groups, of military ordnance and weapons in the hands of soldiers. So these changes are coming, and NATO, to my understanding, will have to work very, very hard to keep up with all this. Because, yes, if it just remains stuck in conventional warfare conceptions of the world, it will become obsolete.
NATO will become obsolete if it does not go with the times, if it's not able to adjust itself. President KALJULAID, you'll get the last word. The headline is NATO will remain relevant in 2030 and beyond. The question is why?
Because we take the right decisions. And we take the right decisions because we have a common situational awareness of the global picture. And we are able to honestly share our opinions, to sort our differences of opinions, if necessary, to adapt and adjust, like adding new domains. We've had in space and cyberspace, for example. And we are basing our discussions and our actions always strongly on the common values. And that is precisely why NATO will survive. It takes a certain amount of political honesty towards your own people as well, to also sometimes talk about risks, because let's agree, I mean, the public discussion in the developed world, because we've long enjoyed peace, has been a little bit avoiding, I mean, these kind of difficult issues, that there are real risks which are coming closer and closer to our society, and as President VÍÄE-FREIBERGA said, to civil society as well. So it takes political courage and honesty, but I mean, NATO has a 100% track record. We will continue taking the right decisions because we will dare.
And political courage and honesty is something that those terms I attach with you both, and as a matter of fact, perhaps best said by one of our viewers on Slido. He says, Baltic states can pride themselves with women in charge in politics, I think nothing more needs to be added for this fascinating discussion on the status quo, but more importantly on the future of NATO. President Freiberga and President KALJULAID, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thanks so much for having you.
Thank you.
Thank you.